Welcome to What Economists Really Do, and thank you for joining us for the first episode of the brand new fourth series. We are excited today to bring you 5 new topics this year, shedding light on some of the most current research in economics. So today's episode will last about 1 hour, including 40-minute talk from Professor Andrea Bernini, and will be followed by a question and answer discussion, where you, the audience, can submit your questions via the Q&A chat window. This window will be monitored throughout the talk, and question will be selected at the end. So the topic today is particularly timely as the US prepares for another pivotal election in November this month. There's been great progress made in racial equality and political representation, but we need to recognize that there is still far to go. And this is where Andrea's research is so insightful. It examines the transformative impact of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, or the VRA. So the VRA dismantled voter suppression and empowered Black Americans in local politics. Andrea's work highlights how the VRA generated a surge in Black voter registration and increased the representation in key local government positions, particularly in county commissions that were responsible for vital resources. But unlike most research, Andrea's work does not just stop there. He also shows that the gains have also faced resistance, and as Black political power grew, especially in areas with large Black population, there was white counter-mobilization efforts to undermine the VRA's impact. So Andrea's analysis is unique because it offers a balanced perspective. We are all eager to know more about this, so without any further ado, I will leave the floor to Andrea for his lecture.
Great, thanks so much, Tomo. And welcome, everybody. I'm very excited to introduce you to the economics of race and politics. So let me start by sharing my screen. Perfect. So I'm really excited today to, as Romo was mentioning, introduce you to the topic of race and politics as part of the What Economists Really Do series of the Department of Economics. As mentioned, in the introduction today, we are going to focus in great detail on one important policy that was passed in the United States in 1965 called the Voting Rights Act, or VRA, which was passed with one clear objective in mind, which was the removal of any type of formal voting restrictions against Black Americans in order to end 100 years following the Reconstruction, any type of systematic disenfranchisement against Black Americans and let Black Americans regain the franchise, so the right to vote. As President Johnson quoted, this was indeed one of the most monumental laws in the history of American freedom. A policy so important that has been reauthorized 5 times since 1965, with the last reauthorization, last extension back in 2006, when Congress decided that this policy should be in place for another 25 years. However, in a very controversial 2013 ruling, where 5 justices voted in favor of removing this policy and 4 justices voting against the removing of this policy, the Supreme Court indeed decided to remove the special provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And by doing so, it effectively ended federal oversight in southern counties, so counties in the US South, as we're going to see in a short while, which had the worst records of minority discrimination. And by reading the decision of the Supreme Court, we can understand why the Supreme Court decided to abolish the Voting Rights Act. In their view, so in the view of the 5 justices that decided to remove the VRA indeed employed extraordinary measures to address an extraordinary problem. They say there is no denying that the conditions that originally justified these measures no longer characterized voting in the covert jurisdictions. And in fact, they quote Census Bureau data, which indicates that turnout rates, so the amount of people voting, so Black turnout rates in this case, has exceeded white voter turnout in basically all of the states that were once subject to the VRA. So in their view, they say the Voting Rights Act has been important, so important and so helpful and so successful that we no longer need it today. So the key question, therefore, is basically try to understand whether the decision of the Supreme Court can indeed be validated through empirical study, in the sense, by looking at the success of the Voting Rights Act, can we say something about whether the decision of the Supreme Court can be justified or not? Like, do we still need it? Do we still need the Voting Rights Act? Or indeed, the success of the Voting Rights Act has been so great that we no longer need it today? So in order to address these important policy questions, what we're going to do today is to selectively review the literature in economics that has tried to understand the Voting Rights Act and the many effects that this policy has had. We are first going to start with a very brief overview of Black voting rights in the US South before the Voting Rights Act. We will then understand what were the key provisions of the policy, and ultimately, importantly, what have been the main impacts, the main effects of this policy across three main dimensions. The first one is political participation. And so here we look at turnout and voter registrations, as we're going to see in a few slides. Secondly, we're going to focus on the effects of the VRA on political representation. So here we're looking at basically the number of Black elected officials. And lastly, we're going to focus on the effects of the VRA on policies, and in particular, local level policies. So basically public goods that are provided by local constituencies, local governing bodies, targeting Black communities. Towards the end of the talk, as Romo was suggesting, we are not going to stop there, but we're also going to focus on the opposition to the policy. And in particular, we're going to try to understand whether there has been any form of resistance to the policy, in particular from racially conservative whites, okay, white voters. So let's start first with a very brief overview of voting practices in the US South before the Voting Rights Act. Shortly after the end of the Civil War, so in 1865, so basically 100 years before the Voting Rights Act, the 15th Amendment was put in place. So it was written in 1869 and then ratified by Congress in 1870. This amendment granted Black men the right to vote. Okay, so after the Civil War in the US South, Black men had the right to vote. And this led very quickly to a very sharp increase in the number of Black office holders. So these are Black officials elected in positions of power in local constituencies. However, this process of increasing Black representation following Black participation was very large, but it was short-lived. Because as early as the 1870s and into the 1880s and 1890s, Southern legislatures, and here we should be thinking about states, but more specifically, even more at the local level, counties, they started to introduce specific measures in order to curtail and reduce Black American rights. What type of measures were put in place? Well, many, but most importantly, poll tax requirements and literacy tests. What were poll tax requirements? Poll tax requirements simply means that in order to register to vote, you have to pay a fee. You have to pay a commission. You have to pay, indeed, a tax. Why was this put in place? Well, because the idea was that they wanted to exclude poor voters from voting. So people that could not afford to pay a poll tax. Secondly, and very importantly, Southern legislatures, they introduced literacy tests. as the name suggests, literacy tests are tests in order to assess the literacy of individuals. Again, with a very clear goal in mind, which was to exclude from the voting process illiterate voters. So, as you can see, both of these policies that were widely introduced in the South shortly after the 15th Amendment, they should have been applied to everybody in the South. In particular, should have been applied to everybody who was poor and illiterate, right? But actually what we know is that these policies were implemented targeting Black Americans. Why? Because white Americans were excluded from these policies through different policies and legislatures that were passed in order to circumvent and go around these poll tax requirements and literacy tests. First and foremost, the grandfather clause, which basically exempted descendants of prior voters and military members from any type of restrictions of voting. And of course, this primarily benefited white voters. Why? Because before the Civil War, basically the only people that could vote were white men. And also the only people serving in the military were white men. And so because of this introduction of the grandfather clause, basically white voters, even if they were poor and illiterate, they could still gain access to voting. Secondly, illiterate whites were further protected in their rights to vote if they were able to show that they owned a certain amount of property, they could interpret a section of the state constitution, they could demonstrate an understanding of the duties of citizens, or could show themselves to be a good moral character, right? And so basically, again, you can see that in this quote, it's clear that the decision of who to register to vote, it's something that is highly arbitrary, right? And it was put in the hands of very specific officials called the registrars. The registrars are local level officials that have one duty, which is to register individuals. And the registrars had this like very ample power in order to decide who basically to register. And as you can see here in the last sentence, they could assess somebody to be fit for voting if this person could show themselves to be a good moral character, something completely arbitrary, subjective. And because of this process, what we end up having is that illiterate whites and poor whites managed to still keep voting, while Black citizens were completely disenfranchised. What we also know is that indeed literacy test, which was indeed the main device in order to exclude Black Americans from voting, was administered in a very discriminatory fashion. So by quoting once again the Commission on Civil Rights of 1965, this literacy test, again, tests that should assess the literacy of individuals, they were hyper-technical, they were unnecessarily difficult, and they vested broad discretion in the hands of these local registrars. They bore little relationships to an individual's ability to read or write or to cast an intelligent ballot, and were extensively utilized to discriminate against Black Americans. Importantly, once again, these local registrars were so powerful that they could apply literacy tests in order to reject educated Black Americans and register illiterate whites. So through this process of systematic disenfranchisement in the US South, Black voters basically lost all the power that they gained shortly after the Civil War. What we see is a complete drop of Black political participation, basically going close to zero, and Black political representation going close to zero. And this, of course, led to a reduction in the type of public goods provisions that local constituencies were giving to Black communities, because they were not voting. So Black voters didn't have the right indeed to vote, and they didn't have any political representation. So these de jure measures, so again, these literacy tests and poll tax requirements, were further complemented by de facto discriminatory practices, in the sense that there was widespread intimidation, there was widespread violence across the US South during especially the first half of the 20th century, which further made the inclusion in the social, political, and economic life of Black Americans even more difficult. So that by 1956, so approximately 10 years before the Voting Rights Act, only about 1 million Black Americans were registered to vote in the 11 southern states of the US South. This is approximately 25% of the Black voting age population. So the Black Americans with the right to vote, only 25% of them, so 1 in 4, were registered to vote. Compare this with white registration rates, which was 60%. So 2 out of 3 white Americans with the right to vote were indeed registered to vote. So completely different picture just before the Voting Rights Act. And so at the height of the civil rights movement, so in early 1965, President Johnson started to outline his plan to pass a legislation that could eliminate every remaining obstacle to the right and the opportunity to vote. And then we didn't have to wait long after, indeed, President Johnson started to outline his plan, because there is a very important event that took place in 1965 called Bloody Sunday. There was a televised event, and so it created a lot of salience in the US electorate when law enforcement, so police officers, they attacked peaceful marchers in Alabama. And this basically created a lot of further momentum for President Johnson to pass the Voting Rights Act. And he declared, indeed, just before he passed the policy, no law we now have on the books can ensure the right to vote when local officials are determined to deny it. So again, he puts the emphasis on these local officials, local registrars that were targeting selectively Black Americans. So what was the Voting Rights Act? The Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1965 had very clear features. The first of all was indeed the removal of any type of discriminatory devices used by local registrars. Secondly, it put in place very important special provisions in order to systematically create methods to deal with discriminatory tests. Here again, literacy tests, with discriminatory testers, the local registrars, and with discriminatory threats, widespread violence, intimidation that was frequent and common in the US South. So the VRA, while applying to the country as a whole, it was a federal policy. It was very cleverly devised in order to target specific places in the US, places with the worst record of disenfranchisement, through a coverage formula. So a county in the US, so this like local unit of governance in the US, would have been covered by the policy, by the VRA, if it satisfied 2 criteria. If it imposed voting restrictions, again, poll tax requirements or literacy test, and if it had less than 50% total turnout in the 1964 presidential election. So if a county satisfied both of these criteria, then it would have been subject to the Voting Rights Act. Of course, if a county was subject to the Voting Rights Act, it had to eliminate any type of voting restrictions. And importantly, any future change in laws at the local level regarding the voting process would have needed to receive pre-clearance from the federal government. This was important because it made sure that local jurisdictions could not simply implement, again, weird regulations that could, again, discriminate Black Americans. Because any voting-related law should have received pre-clearance from the federal government through the Voting Rights Act. Because of this process, 6 states in the US South, and here you have the list, were fully covered, while North Carolina was the only state which was partly covered, because if we go back to the thresholds, for some counties, actually total turnout was higher than 50%, because there were counties with with not great Black population shares. Okay, so they had actually a large turnout in the presidential election. But actually, six states were fully covered by the policy. So the day the VRA was passed, President Johnson called this law a triumph for freedom, as huge as any victory that has ever been won in any battlefields. The law has many pages, but the heart is plain and simple. Wherever states and counties, again, the emphasis on these local jurisdictions, counties, are using regulations or laws or tests to deny the right to vote, then they will be struck down. Okay. However, as we know, voter intimidation tactics persisted. White opposition to the policy in the South was large. However, still, the hope was for this very important policy that was passed in '65 to basically pave the way for future change. In what dimensions? Well, as we have discussed already, in political participation, political representation, and in local level policies. Okay. So the big question is indeed, did the VRA live up to the expectations in these different dimensions? And so in the next part of the talk, we're going to focus on each of these in turn. We're first going to focus on turnout and registration. Then we're going to look at representation, Black office holding. And lastly, we're going to look at changes in local level policies. So first, when we look at turnout, so turnout is basically the number of votes that are cast. Okay, so whether people actually go and vote in an election. Definitely the Voting Rights Act had important positive effect on turnout. The first paper that really studied this question in a very systematic and importantly in economics causal way is the paper by Cascio and Washington, who very cleverly used covered states and look at the behavior of turnout in covered states, so states with the policy, and compare their behavior with states that are very similar to the former states, but they don't have the policy in place. Why not? Because they didn't have literacy tests, right? So if we look at Arkansas, Florida, Tennessee, and Texas, which are states that are very similar along many social, economic, and political characteristics to the states that are covered by the VRA, but they don't have the VRA because they didn't have the literacy test, then we can use these states as sort of a counterfactual of what would have happened to the treated states had they not been subject to the policy, right? So we can do something known in economics as a difference in differences empirical strategy, where we compare the behavior of treatment groups, treatment group with the behavior of the control group. Okay, so groups of counties in this case with the policy, and compare them with groups of counties without the policy. So by doing so, by applying a difference in differences empirical method, we can find out that indeed turnout increased quite a lot in places with the policy. Okay. As mentioned in the paper, turnout increase, and in the paper by Cascio and Washington, they mentioned that this increase in turnout is mostly driven by an increase in Black voter registration. However, in order to precisely claim that the increase is in Black voter registration, you kind of need to partial out any change in white registration rates, right? So instead of looking at total registration rates, you should be looking at the breakdown by race. And you can do it, by either taking away white registration rates from the total registration rates, or by having directly information on Black registration rates, right? This is something hard to do, right? This is something challenging to do, mostly because voter registration records are maintained and collected, as we have learned just before, by local jurisdictions, right? By local registrars. And voter registration records are not routinely compiled and aggregated in official publications. So what I have done with my co-authors in a paper that is available this year, we have collected registration statistics by race, so separating Black voters and white voters, from just before the VRA to 15 years after the VRA. And what we do is to use this data set in order to assess the effect of the policy on Black and white registration rates. So this is just a quick screenshot of the change in registration rates of Black voters and white voters from before to after the policy, okay? And what we notice is, if we look at the left map, the change in Black registration is great. Basically, almost everywhere for where we have the data, we see a very sharp, high increase in registration statistics for Black voters. But importantly, what we notice is that there is also an increase in white registration statistics over this period, okay? Something that we will return later on in the talk. But for now, I would simply like to focus on Black registration rates, and basically, again, by applying a difference in differences empirical strategy, where again, we compare the behavior in this case of registration rates separately by treatment counties and control counties, again, to use control counties as a counterfactual of what would have happened to the treatment counties had they not received the policy. We can notice that just before the policy, 1965, there is no difference in behavior in registration statistics between treatment and control. In other words, they were following like parallel trends. But just after the policy is introduced, we see an increase in Black registration rates. And importantly, this increase in Black registration rates is not something temporary, but rather it seems to be persistent. Okay, so basically the main conclusion from this paper is indeed that covered counties, so counties with the policy, they saw an increase in Black registration rates from 1960 to 1980. However, what we also conclude in this work of mine, we also show that this increase in Black registrations was actually matched by an increase in white registrations, which ultimately narrowed down the progress that could have been achieved had white registration not been there. So what we see here is that without doing some very, very quick back of the envelope calculation, we can see that the gap between Black and white registration statistics would have basically fallen by quite a lot had white registrations not been there, because indeed Black registration increased by quite a large amount. But because white registrations basically moved almost one-to-one to Black registration, then the fall in the gap is basically close to zero. So ultimately in this work, we have shown that the VRA indeed increased Black registration, but this has been matched by basically almost one-to-one by white registration efforts, okay? Something that we call white counter-mobilization, okay? Mobilization against the policy. So now let's turn in the next few minutes on the second important objective of the policy. So the VRA was indeed expected to lead to the election of Black state representatives, county commissioners, sheriffs, councilmen, police chiefs, and even mayors. However, we knew that even back in the day, civil rights activists, although that was the expectation that the VRA was meant to achieve, they were very aware of the obstacles in Black representation, right? Because as mentioned, there was very widespread violence and intimidation across the US South. And especially like when we look at local level election outcomes, Black Americans, even when they gained the franchise, they're still the minority in the county, right? So the election of Black officials is still limited by the fact that Black Americans remain a minority within the relevant jurisdiction. And in fact, if we look at data, numbers of Black Americans elected at the state and federal level, state in the US, we should be thinking about governors, state governors. Federal level, we should be thinking more about members of the Senate or member of the US House of Representatives, right? So the Congress of the US. We have very little Black representation 15 years after the policy, okay? So there has been little gain in representation in these state and federal offices. At the local level, however, the evidence is way more complex, right? And in fact, some studies have shown a positive correlation between the Voting Rights Act and the election of Black officers at the local level. However, no paper really until a work of mine with my co-authors published last year, has really assessed systematically whether indeed the Voting Rights Act has led to a surge, an increase in Black office holders at the local level. So in this paper, we have gathered information on all Black officials that have been elected across different units of governance at the local level. And here we're looking at school district boards, municipalities, and counties. And what we can conclude from our paper, we can conclude that there has been an increase in local level Black office holding from before to after the policy. Okay. Importantly, this increase in Black office holding at the local level came in very important and powerful county officers. Okay, so if we think about the county council is very powerful, right? Because it can decide on matters of taxation and on matters of revenue and matters of spending, expenditures, right? And so the county commissioners is a very powerful local body. And in the US South, it's even more so. It has a lot of powers to decide on these revenue and spending decisions. And what we have not noticed in our data is that the increase in Black office holding came particularly in these very important county commissioners. And in fact, what we conclude in the paper is that it also led to important implications also for local level policies, as we're going to see in the next few slides. Okay, but ultimately here, the point I wanted to make is that across the South, the VRA really completely changed the racial makeup of local governments. So if we take Mississippi as one example, just before the policy in 1964, none of the 81 counties of Mississippi had any Black elected official. And here, again, we're looking at any type of local official, okay? Going from as small as a school board membership to as big as a county commissioner, okay? So across all of these different offices which are elected in the South, basically Mississippi had 0 Black elected official. 3 years later, the first year for which we have good data, 12 counties out of 81 started electing Black officials. By 1980, 15 years later, we have basically 65% of the counties in Mississippi that finally have Black elected officials. Okay. Thirdly, I would like to spend some time talking about local policies. Okay, so as I've hinted already, as I've mentioned already, the election of Black officials was crucial for local policies and the delivery of important public goods in Black communities. And indeed, papers have shown evidence of an increase or an improvement in public spending, right? So for example, these works have documented through case studies that the VRA led to improvements in street paving, garbage collection, fire and police services, right? But more systematic papers in economics have shown indeed an increase, a causal increase in the provision of important services. So for example, in the provision of spending on education, right? So once again, this paper by Cash and Washington in 2014 shows that indeed the share of Black teenagers enrolled in school goes up thanks to this higher spending on education in local communities. And the quality of schooling also correspondingly goes up thanks to the policy. In a paper with my co-authors, we also show that the Voting Rights Act increased more broadly capital spending. What is capital spending? Is spending on big infrastructure projects. You know, think about building a highway, think about building a hospital, think about building a school. So these big infrastructure projects, which again is a decision that local governance units make, went up after the policy. However, we don't find a lot of evidence on increases in current outlays. So this is more like payments for salaries or welfare or more directly subsidies to people. And this is really consistent with the idea that the Voting Rights Act, by expanding the franchise, this process didn't come at the expense of white Southerners. Indeed, citing Wright, the VRA facilitated a biracial coalition for economic growth towards mutually beneficial goals and investment on growth enhancing policy, right? So the idea here is that the Voting Rights Act didn't come at the expense of white Southerners in terms of, lower spending power or lower public goods towards white communities. So in the last part of the talk, I would like to focus more on the reaction to the policy. As mentioned, the VRA had very positive direct effects on increasing Black voters, so Black participation, increases in Black office holding, Black representation, and increases in policies targeting Black communities. However, as President Johnson put it, he was from the South himself. He said, as a man whose roots go deeply into Southern soil, I know how agonizing racial feelings are. I know how difficult it is to reshape the attitudes and the structure of our society, right? So the big question here is trying to evaluate or assess the reaction of white voters to this policy. But before we go into that in detail, I have to give you some quick overview of the political situation of the South before the Voting Rights Act. Well, before the VRA, Southern politics was really dominated by one party only, the Democratic Party. It was a one-party political system. No Republican candidates ran. When they ran, they were rarely elected to office. Any type of political competition was confined within the Democratic primary. So basically it was a competition between Democratic candidates. It was not a competition between Democrats and Republicans. It was a one-party system. But then around mid-1960s, things started to change. And indeed, legislation of the 1960s, legislation linked to the civil rights movement, was indeed credited to be the main driver of what is called the Southern de-alignment. The fact that the Democratic Party in the South started to lose ground and the Republicans started to emerge as a powerful source. This is from a newspaper that I found in 1964, and basically, indeed, they show a very clear picture where the Democratic candidate has won in this local election, but they have been hit by white backlash, right? So the idea here is that, yes, the Democratic candidate has won, but they have been opposed by tough resistance, okay? So the idea is that white voters who have always voted Democratic, they now started to shift towards Republicans and voting against the Democratic candidate. At the same time, we have seen the emergence of white supremacist groups that had very clear one goal in mind, which was the election of white people. So, for example, here the White Citizens Council was one very important white supremacist groups in the South. And here they say in this Orlando, Florida local newspaper, they tell us that the White Citizens Council planned a rally to launch a voter registration drive to add 66,000 white persons to the polling roster. The drive was called to counter Black registration drive. Okay, so here we have this White Citizens Council that basically tries to push very hard white people in Orlando, so in this like local community in Florida, to register, to oppose, to counteract Black registration drive. And these mobilization efforts, they intensified as Black candidates started to appear for the first time on the ballot box. Okay, so here, for example, again, taking this example of the White Citizens Council now of New Orleans in Louisiana, the white voters of these specific districts now are faced with the most serious challenge since Reconstruction time. Okay, so over the past 80 years, there has been no serious challenge, but now because there is a Black candidate on the ballot box, these white voters are faced with this big, serious challenge, according to this newspaper of Louisiana. So let's study in a bit more detail what has happened in terms of white resistance to this policy. The first paper to systematically address this question has been the paper by Kuzienko and Washington in 2018, who indeed studied the exodus, so the movement away of Southern whites from the Democratic Party, and they claim that it started as early as the spring of 1963, when President Kennedy addressed the nation for the first time very openly on civil rights. And of course, this exodus of Southern whites away from the Democratic Party, it accelerated very quickly after the Voting Rights Act. In their paper, they say they used survey data to basically find the amount of people that switch identification away from the Democratic Party towards the Republican Party. And they find that the Democratic identification among white Southerners, so white voters of the South, relative to whites around the US, so not in the South, fell by 17 percentage points. So there has been a sharp drop in the affiliation of white voters to the Democratic Party in the South compared to the rest of the US. And what they claim is that this decline was entirely driven by Southern whites. In my recent work, we indeed find, as I mentioned before, an increase in white political participation, which is indeed consistent with this idea of counter-mobilization. And in fact, we find that white registration is higher, so the increase is higher, right after the election of the first Black official. So as soon as you see a Black official winning office in the South, in these like local level offices, white voters in that locality, they start registering more. So in the very, very final part of the presentation, I would like to think a little bit about whether we can measure more precisely the characteristics of white voters. We can use, to answer this question, we can use a survey called Gallup, which basically from 1958, they started to ask racial views in the context of politics. So we focus on one specific questions of this survey. And the question is that, the question that they asked to respondents is, if your party nominated a well-qualified man for president, would you vote for him if he happened to be Black American? Okay, so the question is directly, would you vote for a Black candidate for the presidential election? And so then we can look at the characteristics of the respondents to this survey that say, no, I will not vote for a Black candidate. And what we find out is that respondents to this survey who are male, who are rural residents, who are older, and who have lower education, who have a low education, they tend to answer no to that question more frequently than other white voters. Okay, so this is a bit qualitative, let's say, in our analysis. We should not really pin it down to any causal analysis here, but definitely, the story seems to go in the direction that we expected, that there seems to be certain characteristics of individuals that can be linked to this counter-mobilization story. So one more slide to tell you that the Voting Rights Act has been removed, basically has been abolished in 2013, as mentioned earlier in the presentation, in a very controversial ruling in 2013. Again, the 5 justices that voted in favor of removing the VRA, they said that basically we no longer need this policy, right? So they say 50 years later, things have changed dramatically. Voter turnout and registration, so 2 of the main things that we looked at today, turnout and registration, approach parity. Discriminatory evasions are rare, so we don't see like local counties trying to go around the federal decision. Minority candidates, so here we're looking at Black office holders, again, another important outcome that we looked at today. Minority candidates hold office at unprecedented levels. Okay, so this was basically the main reason why they decided to get rid of the VRA. However, shortly after this decision in 2013, new laws in the south of the US have started to emerge once again, basically making voting for minorities much harder. Okay, so here we have seen the implementation across many states of very strict, stringent photo ID requirements, where basically you have to show a photo ID in order to register. And sometimes this photo ID, if it doesn't match by a little bit, then you cannot register. We have seen states to purge their voter rolls, so their voter registration statistics much more frequently and basically just before the election period. So again, they force people to register, and sometimes it's not that easy to register. And lastly, we have seen a large amount of closing of polling places in states that had this policy before, right? So basically what happens here is that it seems to be that polling places are closing just before the poll, just before the election, and in localities with a large amount, with a large share of Black Americans, right? And so basically, again, it seems that there are policies that have been passed in order to once again disenfranchise Black Americans. And so I want to leave you with these quotes from this attorney of the Legal Defense Fund, which when he was discussing the Supreme Court decision, he said, unless someone happens to know to call us, and we happen to have the resources or the money and the people to bring that litigation, nothing ever happens. So many things slip through the cracks and have a real impact on Black representation, right? So basically he says here, without the Voting Rights Act, everything became much more costly because now we have returned to basically a very costly case-by-case kind of litigation process, right? So where one county does something and then you have to protest to that in local courts and this back and forth, right? And this takes time, takes energy. So sometimes he says, we cannot do much about that. So I think this talk leaves us with a lot of important questions, right? So let's focus on the first one. How can governments pass laws to support minority groups without causing majority group backlash, right? More specifically to the US, how can we introduce laws which positively influence white Americans' racial attitudes towards Black Americans? And more generally, how can we think of the conditions which enable policies of government to shape the beliefs of individuals and social norms? So I would like to thank you all for being with me today, and I will be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. That was very, very interesting. For all the audience, you can post your question on the Q&A, and I will have a pleasure to read them. So maybe I will start with a question that's already there in the Q&A. So Andrea, you used the phrase or the word systematic analysis. And the question was, what do you mean by doing a systematic analysis? And particularly when we talk about an economic study, what are the conditions for a study to be called systematic analysis?
Yeah, thank you. So I think for systematic, we can mean probably two things, right? So one thing could be from the data side, a collection of all the statistics that are needed in order to answer the specific research questions that you have in mind, right? So the idea that you have collected enough variables or information on the variables that you care about in order to answer the specific research question. So in my talk, for example, when I use the word systematic, when I talk about systematic collection of voter registration statistics, I mean that I have collected as much information on voter registration statistics as is available to us today, or when I talk about the representation of Black officials, then again, I've collected as much information that is available on Black officials as we have today, right? So that's like a systematic collection. But then more broadly, when you say a systematic study in economics, I think that concerns more with the empirical strategy method, right? So the ability to pin down the causality from, in this case, a policy to the outcome of interest, right? So the ability to address in a causal way the question of whether X leads to Y, right? So in this case, whether the policy leads to a change in the outcome variable.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. I will go to the next question. You talked about the effect of VRAs on the level of investment in public goods. And there is a question whether the level of investment in public goods, whether it declined, increased, or shifted between white communities and Black communities as a consequence of a VIA.
Yeah, thank you, Rom. And so this depends very much on the type of public goods that we consider, right? So on one hand, if we look, for example, at capital projects, so as mentioned, investments in big infrastructure projects, the building of highways, say, or paving roads, these kind of like very expensive activities that counties engage on, then definitely there has been an improvement in these conditions, right? But what I said during the talk is that this doesn't seem to have come at the expense of other types of provisions that are more directed at the individuals, right? So what we call usually the current outlays. Why there hasn't really been a shift away from one and toward the other, but rather simply like an increase in capital spending without a reduction in current spending? Well, because there seems to be, like the paper of Cash in Washington demonstrate, an increase in the amount of funds that have been channeled towards these communities, right? So if we think about the ability to spend of local communities, that has increased, right? So the revenue side has increased, and that has allowed the expenditure side, so the spending side, to basically have this increase in capital spending without really having a reduction in current spending. So ultimately, so the answer, I don't think there has been like a shift away, like a trade-off, but rather there has been like an increase in capital spending without a corresponding decline in current spending, mostly thanks to this higher, let's say, channeling of resources from the state to these communities where we have observed more, for example, higher Black registration.
Okay, brilliant. One other question. So you find that as a result of the VIA, you have more Black candidates that are now elected. Is it possible to know whether it's the effect of the VIA or it's just the effect of the Black candidates becoming just more educated, better candidates in some sense?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question, and it really speaks to work in progress that I'm currently doing on basically studying more specifically the characteristics of Black officials. But definitely, just by looking at the number of Black officials, it's impossible, to understand whether it's because the characteristics of the candidates become better, or simply because the VRA created a favorable environment for the election of any candidate, right? But I think, especially if we look like at the early years after the Voting Rights Act, so let's say the first 10 years after the Voting Rights Act, it's kind of unlikely, right, that the characteristics of the candidates might have changed so quickly, so dramatically. So there seems to be more evidence a little bit that goes in favor of the idea that it is the important ruling and frameworks of the Voting Rights Act that allowed more Black candidates to win office, right? But it's interesting, if we switch more towards the present time, it would be interesting to understand across many offices, right, where we still see a big gap in the number of Black officials relative to white officials. It would be interesting to better understand why that is the case. And this goes very much back to the idea of the Supreme Court removing the Voting Rights Act. Because in their minds, in their statements, it seems like they are pointing to the fact that the conditions of the policy are no longer needed, right? And so they're pointing more to the idea that you are suggesting that the characteristics of the candidates have basically improved, and so there is no need anymore for any formal protection in terms of like electoral rules, for example. But we still see a big gap in office holdings, and so the question is, can we like disentangle the two factors, right? So this is something that I'm actively working on right now.
Mm-hmm. And maybe a question that brings us a bit more into the contemporaneous time. Do you have any lessons for us for the current election or any thoughts that you would like to share about this?
It's tricky, right? And it will be a tricky one, right? But it's interesting to see how a lot of the things that we have discussed today uh, that have looked at the past 60 years and even before, if we go all the way back to the Civil War, are basically still very much relevant in today's political discussion, right? So, this idea of like redistricting, or this idea of voting ID requirements, or voting by post or electronic voting, this kind of idea of how easy or how hard it is for individuals to register to vote. It's so significant, right, that we're still talking about this for something that should have already been addressed back in the day, right? But ultimately, in terms of like the result of the election, that I don't know, but definitely it's for, for me as a researcher, I think it's super relevant and interesting how important these questions that have been addressed from like 60 years ago are still like relevant today, I think, in today's political discussion.
Maybe a 1 minute question. If we see that a black candidate has been elected in, say, one county A, and he provides good governance, do we see any evidence of spillover on the nearby counties? Is it something you have investigated in 1 minute, if you can?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is an excellent question, really, and it depends on, I guess, what we're measuring in terms of spillovers, right? Are we measuring in terms of like voter registrations? Are we measuring in terms of like salience of specific topics, etc., related to racial inequality? So it really depends, I think, on the outcome that we are looking at. For registration statistics, for example, we don't really see a spillover, right? So there seems to be very much a concentration in the local unit of governance without much spillover to nearby communities, right? And this again goes in favor of the idea that white registration was very much a counter-mobilization to Black political empowerment at the local level, in the sense that we see white registration spiking in the local communities where we see, for example, the election of a Black official, right? But in nearby counties where, for example, there wasn't this improvement in Black office holding, for example, we don't really see an increase in white registration statistics. So on this specific metric, white registration, there doesn't seem any evidence on spillover across neighboring counties. But if we look at local public goods, even there, if I remember correctly, there doesn't seem to be a lot of like spillovers going on. But so yeah, it depends, I guess, on the outcomes that we look at. But I think the evidence that I have available at hand is really speaks to a very localized effect of the Voting Rights Act, right? Driven by the election of Black officials.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. So,
Thank you.
For all the audience, remember that the recording of this episode, it will be available on the Department Economics YouTube channel. And for those who have registered with an email address, you will receive a notification of the recording once it's uploaded. Our next episode will be a special lecture and panel discussion on macroeconomics and climate with Professor Andrea Chiavari on the 14th of November. So you can already sign up for free today via the Department of Economics website. And again, thank you for joining Andrea and I today for the economics of race and politics. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.